We are very excited today to talk to our guest, Bee Nguyen. She's a member of the Georgia House of Representatives and represents a district in the Atlanta area that was once represented by friend of the pod, Stacey Abrams. Bee, thank you so much for doing the show.
Thanks for having me on. And that is my piece of street cred, because most of the time people are very uninterested that I'm a state rep until I tell them, well, I have the seat that Stacey Abrams had before she decided to run for governor.
It means you are already doing and destined for great things is the takeaway here. So we wanted to talk with you today because there's a growing conversation about voter suppression in the wake of the 2020 election. And Georgia, unfortunately, is at the center of it. Republicans in Georgia have introduced a sweeping voter suppression bill in response to their election losses in November and then again in January. Can you fill us in on some of the specific things that this piece of legislation would do?
Sure. So I do want to start off by saying this. In the past 4 sessions that I've served in the Georgia General Assembly, I have seen bills related to voter suppression every single year. And obviously the country has seen the long lines here in Georgia, sometimes spanning up to 11 hours for people who are waiting in line to cast a ballot. And we saw a lot of the voter suppression manifest itself in 2018. And so this is not new to Georgia, though this year it is more aggressive than it has been in the past because of the results of the 2020 election and then the 2 U.S. Senate runoff seats in 2021. Right. So Republicans dropped a 48-page omnibus bill sort of encompassing all of these things that they've been talking about for the past year and the past several years. And so it does a number of things that would be damaging to both local election boards and to voters. So to begin with, I'll highlight some of the top liners. One, it restricts local election boards from receiving any kind of grant funding. In 2020, there was grant funding that all local election boards could apply for to make up for some of the added financial cost of running elections in a pandemic and running an election with unprecedented turnout. And so that restriction would take money away from election boards. And thus far, we haven't seen the Secretary of State commit to allocating more funds. The messaging behind that is it's liberal organizations specifically targeting certain counties and giving them liberal money. But we see that Republican counties have also received those grant fundings, and they have been given the discretion to use them in a way that supports all voters. So some of the things were new equipment, PPE, and hazard pay for their workers. 2, there's a massive attack on absentee ballots, which Republicans have been planting that seed prior to the results of the June primary, prior to the results of the November and January elections. The messaging around absentee ballots is that it opens the door or it is ripe for fraud, though we have actual no evidence as it pertains to absentee ballots being insecure. In fact, the audit in Cobb County showed that out of 15,000 ballots, 2 came back, but they were both valid legal voters. One was a wife who signed the ballot for her husband, which is understandable. I think in a lot of situations, family members say, oh, go ahead and sign it for me without understanding the full implication of the law. And the second ballot was somebody who signed on the front of the ballot versus the back of the ballot. And so the restrictions around absentee ballot voting are related to showing ID. When you apply to vote in Georgia, when you apply for registration, you already have to show a form of ID. One of the reasons absentee ballot voting is so successful for older voters, for rural voters, for people who basically don't have access to internet, smartphones, printers, is that that information is already stored with election boards and the Secretary of State. And so the new provision would require somebody to enter in a driver's license number or a valid state ID number. And if they don't have those things, then they have to make a copy of an ID and send it in the mail, which also I think is disconcerting to voters for security reasons, because we know that voter fraud isn't an issue in Georgia, but identity theft certainly is an issue. There is an attack on secure drop boxes. This is probably one of the most absurd pieces of the legislation. We successfully implemented secure drop boxes in most of our counties, especially our metro counties. And those drop boxes already have regulations around them. They have to be monitored 24/7 by video surveillance. They have to be bolted to the ground. They have to be on government property, ADA accessible, and election boards have to empty them at least once a day. In this bill, those secure drop boxes can only be located at early voting locations inside the building and only during the hours in which the early voting location is open. That means if you are a worker who works in non-traditional hours, like many workers do, you would have to go between 7 and 7 or whenever the hours are for that specific day. The convenience of the secure drop boxes were also so that people would not have to go inside and expose themselves further to other people. So the other piece of that is election boards invested a lot of money in these drop boxes. And now they are going to potentially see all of those financial investments being wasted. And in testimony last week, all the election directors that testified said that they liked the drop boxes and voters liked the drop boxes as well. There is also a provision that would no longer allow a voter who came to the wrong precinct but was in the right county to cast a provisional ballot. That would automatically throw out a significant number of valid ballots. The example that I like to give is on election day in November, I was a poll monitor, and the precinct that I monitored was also an early voting location. So voters thought that it would also be open to everybody on election day. And so they came to this early voting location to cast their ballot. They were in the right county. They cast their ballots provisionally, and those are automatically cured at the end of the night by elections boards. And so in that particular precinct, there were probably about 600 people who voted in person. Over half of those were provisional ballots. That means automatically 300 people in just one precinct in one of our largest counties, their ballots would not have counted, even though they are legitimate voters. So those are a few of the things on the table in this 48-page omnibus bill.
Seems wildly complicated and solving a problem that doesn't exist. So what communities do you think would be the most impacted by this bill if it passed?
Oh, I actually forgot, as you're asking me about the community issue, one of the most blatant things in this is the prohibition of local election boards to expand weekend voting and to eliminate Sunday voting altogether. Yeah. So in 2020, over 70,000 voters voted on Sunday, and of those 70,000, over 36% were Black Georgians. So the elimination of souls to the polls is directly targeted at Black voters who turned out in unprecedented numbers. So it will be Black voters, older voters, rural voters, and then people who simply just can't make it to the polls because of the demands of their job.
What argument are Republicans putting forward for eliminating Sunday voting? Let's pretend they're acting in good faith for 5 seconds. What is the argument there?
There is none. They have been very, I think, smart and strategic not to address that specific portion. And so when they're talking about this bill, a lot of their focus is around absentee ballot and alleged fraud, or just one single incident of fraud being a justification for changing these laws. And so they haven't had a response to Sunday voting. It is just so blatantly obvious that it is targeted towards souls to the polls that I'm not sure that they will be able to come up with a reason as to why eliminating Sunday voting improves election security or elections integrity in any way.
Yeah. So you're right that voter suppression has been a problem in Georgia and in many states for decades, if not the last several years. But one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this specific bill today is because it is, advancing this lie that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, that our elections are no longer trustworthy. And we suspect that that will be perpetuated in lots of states that are controlled by Republicans as part of a broader voter suppression effort. You have spent more time than most people have or possibly could trying to disprove that lie, going through voter rolls. How effective is that effort to correct the disinformation, and how much damage do you think has been done to Georgians' faith in the voting process?
They have repeated this lie so many times, and they not only repeating the lie, but allow misinformation to go unchecked. So in the committee hearings in which Rudy Giuliani and Trump's team came in, there were so many instances of lies and misinformation, and Republicans were silent, knowing that what was being said by witnesses in these committee hearings was not true. And in some cases, they weren't even controversial. It is true that it is legal for both parties to have a ballot curing program. It's not disputable. It is in our state law. And so the fact that they were unwilling to speak up at any point in that committee meeting just to correct some of the information, the fact that we had members sign on to the Texas lawsuit knowing that the election was not stolen, and the fact that they continue to allow all of this to go on, it is really challenging to undo, because we know if you hear a lie a certain number of times, people begin to believe it. But what they're doing is a disservice to their voters. And we saw that with the January election, in which our voters were enthusiastic. We turned out. People were excited to vote. When I was a poll monitor in DeKalb County on that day, I talked to both Republican and Democratic voters. Republican voters were angry. They were very angry, but they were not angry at Democrats. They were angry at their own party. They were reluctant to vote. They felt like their vote didn't count or it didn't matter. In fact, I had to help a Republican woman look up her vote on the Secretary of State website to show her that it did count. And she did leave after that, but she had pulled up in her car just yelling and angry. So I think that it has done irreparable harm. We saw violence towards our election workers, threats towards our election workers, and we see massive pressure from Republican constituents to fix something that wasn't broken in the first place. And I think that some of this stuff is going to come back and bite them in the butt, because the bill that passed no excuse absentee ballot voting in 2005 was passed by Republicans to turn out rural voters. So some of this stuff is going to suppress their own votes.
Part of why we're having this conversation today is these voter suppression efforts are happening in dozens of states, and a lot of people are looking to the U.S. Congress for help. There's a bill before the Senate and the House, there's H.R. 1 and S1, that would do a whole bunch of things to help prevent voter suppression efforts like this, like what's happening in Georgia, from happening. How would H.R. 1 impact Georgia's ability to fight back against this voter suppression law?
Look, we have been, banking on winning these 2 U.S. Senate seats. And one of those reasons is because we need to have a federal Voting Rights Act that can act as a safeguard against some of the things that we're seeing in the state legislature. And specifically, the pre-clearance provision, I assume that would be restored and protect some of the things that are going to get passed in the state of Georgia. But H.R. 1 also does a lot of things that we've been proactively trying to do in the state of Georgia, such as same-day voter registration, such as codifying the ability to use secure drop boxes, to use absentee ballots with no excuses. So it is extremely critical that Congress passes H.R. 1, because what we're looking at in the state of Georgia with this omnibus bill is something that is going to have a devastating impact on voter turnout in the state of Georgia. But also, it is taking us back to a time in which people are having to fight for the right to vote again. And I think somebody said it best when they said, this is Jim Crow in a suit. It is Jim Crow in a suit. And when we think about the history of this country, it was founded on the premise that the only people who could vote were white men who owned land. And if we think about what is happening now, it looks like those restrictions are going back to a place where Republicans believe in the severe limitations of who should be allowed to vote. It's gone as far as a Republican woman who served in the legislature a couple of years ago suggesting that there ought to be an education level associated with the ability to vote. Wow. Basically, a literacy test. And so we're in a really dangerous place as we begin to see that voters of color are coalescing and building these broad-based coalitions so that we can see policies that change our lives in a meaningful and positive way. And so I think, we're in a really dangerous place in the state of Georgia. We need Congress to act and to act swiftly, because these election laws are not just related to voting in elections, but it will fundamentally change so many things in our state. And then we have redistricting coming up as well. And some of those things pertaining to redistricting are also covered in both the H.R. 1 and the companion bill.
Well, we got to get rid of that filibuster. We got to pass those bills. Bee Nguyen, thank you so much for doing the show. Thanks for all you're doing to raise awareness about this and to fight back on these voter suppression efforts. It is ugly stuff, and we really appreciate your wisdom today.
Thanks for having me on. Thanks for all y'all do.